evening from Jakarta and good morning for those tuning in from the United States. My name is Kiara and I will be your MC for the next 1 hour. Welcome to the final dialogue of the Climate Hero series. This program is brought to you by Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, the largest foreign policy group in the country and Southeast Asia, with the support of the United States Embassy in Indonesia. And each month, through this program, FPCI brings a pair of climate heroes from Indonesia and the United States in a virtual dialogue with the Indonesian public. These heroes are prominent figures in policy, academia, think tank, businesses, government, who are leading the fight against climate crisis and taking steps in transforming their community for a climate resilient future. And now we are welcoming hundreds of participants from Indonesia and Southeast Asia and all over the world, joining live on Zoom and YouTube at Secretariat FPCI. Welcome, everyone. And now, on behalf of FPCI, we would like to give a big thank you to our partners. First, we have our university partners, our FPCI chapters, and our community partners, as well as our media partners for supporting this event. As I am sure everyone's excited to jump into the discussion, before then, please keep in mind the following housekeeping rules. First, when you are not speaking, please make sure that your audio is muted and make sure that your camera is turned on throughout the session. Don't forget to rename your Zoom user with your name and institution. And all attendees can ask questions by submitting it through the Zoom chat box or the YouTube chat box. Please state your name and your institutional affiliation before mentioning your question. Please maintain decorum in the chat box as we encourage cordial discussion and interactions with other attendees. Please also stay tuned until the end of the session to confirm your attendance and receive your certificate. We will distribute attendance form nearing the end of the session. And lastly, for your information, we provide live interpretation from English to Bahasa Indonesia. If you are joining from Zoom, you can click on the bottom right of your screen for language options. Kami menyediakan penerjemah dari bahasa Inggris ke bahasa Indonesia, dan bagi para peserta yang ingin mendengarkan dengan audio bahasa Indonesia, mohon klik opsi interpretation di layar bagian bawah kanan. Kemudian pilih opsi Indonesia dan lakukan mute pada original audio. Untuk penonton yang bergabung via YouTube, dapat mengakses YouTube link dengan interpretasi bahasa Indonesia. And now, ladies and gentlemen, in this final dialogue of the Climate Heroes series, we have two very distinguished climate heroes. From the US, joining us live from Sharm el-Sheikh, Aisha Siddiqa, an American-Pakistani climate justice activist and co-founder of Polluters Out. And from Indonesia, we have Farwiza Farhan, chairperson of HAKA, who is also just recently named as one of the Time 100 Next 2022 honoree. Welcome, everyone. And now, without wasting any more time, before we jump into the discussion, let us watch the highlights video of our past Climate Heroes dialogue. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, to open today's Climate Heroes Finale Dialogue, I invite Ms. Rachel Cook, the Counselor for Public Diplomacy at the U.S. Embassy, Jakarta. Ms. Cook, you may have the floor.
Thank you very much, Kiera. And I love the video. It's great. People from 86 countries, over 9,000, nearly 10,000 participants throughout the year. I'm really impressed with the whole series. It's been wonderful to see it take place. Good evening, everyone. As Kiera said, I'm Rachel Cook. I'm the Counselor for Public Diplomacy at the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta. And I think I said good evening. I might have said good morning. Good morning from Washington, D.C., where you can see the sun rising behind me. I am delighted to join you all today in this final of FPCI's Climate Heroes virtual discussion. Thank you, of course, Ambassador Dino Jalal and the FPCI team for making this Climate Heroes series happen. I also really want to thank today's speakers and moderators, Fawzia Farhan, the chairperson of Forest, Nature, and Environment Aceh Foundation, Aisha Siddiqa, the co-founder of Polluters Out and an alumna of the U.S. government's International Visitors Leadership Program in 2014, and Esther Tamara, the director of FPCI's Climate Unit. Thank you all, really, for sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us today. So 12 months ago, when this series kicked off, U.S. Ambassador Sung Kim opened it. And he emphasized at that time the United States' commitment to working with Indonesia to address the climate crisis. Since then, FPCI, through a grant provided by the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta, has brought together experts and leaders from the United States and Indonesia to address our shared challenges and the path forward. Climate Heroes has provided a platform for discussions on the environment and the economy, climate diplomacy, investing in the planet, and working toward a net zero world, just to name a few. Recognizing that the climate crisis is something that affects everyone and that all individuals can contribute to the solution, FPCI Climate Heroes has gathered representatives from every generation, from government to civil society, from the boardroom to the classroom. These discussions have presented opportunities for collaboration and developed a network of people dedicated to addressing the climate crisis. These discussions have inspired thousands of viewers over the past 12 months. And if you missed any of them, don't worry, they are all available online on the FPCI Climate Heroes website. Now, combating the global climate crisis requires ambitious global and national commitments, real commitments, driving strong action in a very decisive decade. Right now is the most important time. No single country can solve these problems alone. In Indonesia, the U.S. Embassy has been intensely engaged with the government of Indonesia on raising our collective climate ambition. We are committed to our bilateral U.S.-Indonesia climate dialogue and continue to work with the government, business, and civil society to address the climate crisis. The United States and Indonesia are collaborating to significantly accelerate its energy transition to renewables this decade, aided by public and private investment from the US, Japan, and other country partners. I think we might hear a little more about that and next week, perhaps, when President Biden travels to Bali for the G20 summit. So stay tuned. We are also doubling down on our efforts to confront the climate crisis domestically here in the US. the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 will reduce domestic carbon emissions by roughly 40% by 2030 by unlocking domestic energy and transmission projects, which will lower consumer costs and help us meet our long-term emission goals. Now, all of this is reminding me that we all can be climate heroes. We all are part of the solution. Even going back a long time, it doesn't matter what you're doing and who you are. I am definitely reminded of 1986 when a 16-year-old me and my best friend went to our town council during the monthly council meeting, and we stood up and we gave a suggestion for starting a recycling program in our town, something that was not being done in our town or even the surrounding towns. It was something new at the time to recycle cans and bottles and cardboard. And we got that pushed through as teenagers. We made it happen. And all of the discussions, the conversations, and the actions being taken by FPCI and all of you really make a difference. And I want to thank you for your ongoing and continued work in this field. The climate crisis is very real and very important, and I really appreciate everything that everyone is doing. Certainly, there is much more for us to do, but we are going to get through this climate crisis together. As Ambassador Kim said last year when opening this series, discussions like the one tonight present a glimmer of hope in our shared resolve to preserve this magnificent planet. So thank you again to Pactino and the FPCI team for their incredible work on this program. And thank you all for joining us for today's event. And I hope you enjoy the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cook, for your warm, welcoming remarks. And now, everyone, without further ado, let us begin the Climate Heroes Finale Dialogue. I will now pass over the mic to our moderator, Esther Tamara, the Director of FPCI Climate Unit. Over to you, Esther.
Thank you, Kiara, and thanks so much for everybody joining. And I'm very excited to be moderating this particular panel because this panel brought along two very inspirational climate heroes figures from the United States and Indonesia. These are young people making change and driving change. So again, thank you for the U.S. Embassy for supporting us in this endeavor. And as Ibu Rachel said, we really look forward for the good news for the Indonesia-United States partnership next week. Announced at the G20. Hopefully anything that can help us meet a net zero future is one that we should support. So let me introduce today's speakers. First, we have Farwiza Farhan, the chairperson of HAKA. She is our climate hero from Indonesia, and she's joining us from Los Angeles, United States, as she's traveling right now. Hello, Mbak Wiza, how are you?
Hi, good afternoon, I guess, in Indonesia.
Good afternoon, good evening, good night, good morning, wherever we are, right? And I want to also greet Aisha Siddiqa, co-founder of Polluters Out, and I've been told that she's joining us live from COP27. How are you, Aisha?
I'm great, and I am indeed in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27, so my apologies if my connection is a little bad.
No, that's okay. Thank you so much for joining us, even from the sidelines of COP. So again, this conversation, this topic is for tonight is very broad, which is climate action towards a net zero world. So we'll be talking about the energy sector, fossil fuels industry, and of course, it's a very timely conversation that we're having right now because COP27 is going on in Egypt. And we also will touch upon the role of nature-based solutions, protecting forests, and the role of young people, of course, in driving climate action. So let me first pose the question to Aisha. So Aisha, the UN Sec-Gen Antonio Guterres said that we are actually on a highway to climate hell. And our foot is on the accelerator, right? At COP27 right now, can you share with us your observations? Are we progressing? Are we moving forward? Are we backtracking? What is the mood there?
Yeah, so the Secretary General, his statements don't come from a hyperbole. And I think that really needs to be understood. So this is a 27th conference of its kind. These conferences were established to help mitigate climate. And we've emitted more carbon in the atmosphere since the beginning of this conference than ever. At the moment, the current finance needed to tackle the climate crisis has not been established. And nation states are still debating whether or not countries and communities who are facing natural disasters should have mechanisms to get out of them. When the SG says we are on a pathway to climate hell, that means that collectively, and especially in the global north, we are not stopping our production of fossil fuel as fast as we should. We are not investing in a green transition as fast as we should. We are not ensuring that communities that are protecting nature still have that nature to protect. I am in the United States, and I suppose I'm representing the US champion, but I'm also Pakistani. And the world ended for my community this year. When the floods came, they wiped away entire villages. They wiped away entire homes. When climate hell has already approached because the losses and damages are accumulating. When one experiences a natural disaster, whether it is a typhoon, whether it is a flood, whether it is a drought, heat waves, when you don't have the infrastructure to get out of it, that climate crisis, that initial natural disaster becomes a humanitarian crisis. So in Pakistan, the water did not evaporate soon enough. And because the water did not evaporate, mosquitoes started sitting on that still water. And now we have malaria, dengue, cholera, spread like wildfire. Mothers are giving, 65,000 women were pregnant during the flooding and were expected to, because we had such massive destruction and loss of crop, loss of community. So many women did not.
Aisha, I think we're losing you.
Enough hemoglobin to give birth. We are not just climate hell, but like a war.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is it any better?
Okay, I think you're back now. And I noted down the comments that you made that, the flooding in Pakistan is severely impacting the women, and it's even triggered a wave of malaria, dengue fever, and many others. And I'd love to come back to that conversation, but I want to bring in Faruiza into this conversation now. You're also an outspoken advocate for strengthening the role of civil society in solving the climate crisis, and you're a forest conservationist as well. So when we know that the climate crisis will hit the community first, the people first, can you tell us what is the important role of nature-based solutions, protecting our nature, protecting our forests in solving this whole climate challenge?
Thank you, Esther. I mean, before I start, I want to ask the audience, and how angry do you feel when you hear Aisha's story? How angry do you feel when you understand the context that is currently happening on the other side of the world, that we might not have connect to our own experience, but knowing that those people are people, and knowing that what they're going through, and knowing that we have a role in making sure not more of us are experiencing the same thing. In the work that I do in forest conservation, it started off as a love for animals. And then I learned how we are all so connected to our environment, that somehow whatever happened around us will happen to us. Our human health and environmental health are so inextricably linked. Sadly, initially when we talked about crises such as changing climate, we looked at it from a very narrow perspective of reducing carbon emissions. And of course, there's a whole lot of things that play an important role in reducing our carbon emissions, from reducing or eliminating fossil fuel from our energy productions, to restoring forests. The aspect on the role of nature in bringing solutions to climate problems is something that we knew, or we should have known, for the longest of time, but only come into the conversation quite recently. The research have shown that about 30% of land where biodiversity is still thriving, where forest is still standing, are actually that way because they are managed by indigenous communities. And these are the kind of wisdom that we have lost in the course of creating this problem and coming into this solution. So the work that we do on the ground is making sure that nature-based solutions are designed by including everyone in the picture, from local community in the area, women in the area, as well as to think about wildlife in the area. We are working with local community to, I hate to say local community because they are community just like you and I. I do not want to localize them to only a certain region. But the work that we do with them have strengthened the role of women in the picture, as well as Aisha mentioned earlier. When climate disaster struck and it manifested in a form of floods or landslides, increasing rains that impact the entire communities. This is the same story that I'm getting from the group of women that we are working with. They told us that the worst part about forest destruction is the floods that come after. And the worst part about floods is how we live like refugee around our homes and how we can't come back. And this is why they choose to restore forests. I'm sorry, I'm not very coherent. This is a bit like 3 a.m. in the morning, and I think I'm losing my thoughts.
Thank you, Mbawisa, for that. And as you asked whether or not people are angry, I can read some comments saying that they are angry, they're upset. And Hajra from Pakistan said, as a Pakistani and working on flood response with Oxfam in Pakistan, I can confirm that what Aisha said is 100% true. People don't even have basic necessities of life to survive. So my next topic of conversation is intersectionality. The climate change crisis, and then the intersectionality to racial justice, and how communities play a role actually in this whole phenomenon, right? And mostly people who are impacted worst by the climate crisis are those who are people of color, and then women and children. And I know that Aisha focuses a lot on this effort, but I think that she lost her connection just now, so I'm going to bring her in later. And I'd like to follow up with Mbawisa. Indonesia is known as the lung of the world. So as a forest conservationist, can you tell us, are we doing enough? What can be done more?
Interesting thing, when we talk about forests, we talk a lot less about forest gain. We talk more about forest loss. And when we talked about protecting forests, we tend to gravitate around reducing deforestation. There's a whole lot of mechanism that comes in with the framework of reducing deforestation. We tend to not realize that when we choose to go on a path of reducing deforestation, we are aiming for loss already. We are aiming, instead of aiming for a healthy ecosystem, it's like we're losing a little less. It is as if we have cancer, and I mean, I'm sorry to use this terminology. It may be offensive to some, but it's a little bit like as if we have cancer, instead of looking for a cure, a heal state where we are healthy, we want to be a little less ill. And that's the unfortunate situation when we think about forest protection and its role in reducing carbon emission. In reality, what we need is aiming for that healthy ecosystem where both human, wildlife, and planet thrive. Old growth forests have way broader role than carbon sink alone. Carbon sink is simply one of the roles that old growth forests are playing. We are facing not only climate crisis, but also biodiversity crisis. And for as long as we see this planetary interaction and ecosystem interaction is something separate, we will never get to a solution that would be all-encompassing the problems that we have created today.
And thank you for sharing that with us, Mbak Wiza. For all of our audience, we know that Indonesia has updated its NDC, its climate commitment, and unfortunately under that NDC, it still allows for thousands of hectares of deforestation, which is very concerning for us on the ground. Okay, I want to ask whether Aisha is back online. Aisha, are you here? Can you hear us? It seems that she's still having some problems with her connection. Can you hear us? Okay, so yes, Aisha, we just want to ask you one question. Earlier, you told us your story about the floods in Pakistan and Hello? Perhaps Aisha can turn off her camera so that we can get a more stable connection. Can the team please help address this issue? In the meantime, Mbak Wiza, there's a question already, and I'd love for you to answer this question from your perspective. Sheila from Kenya asked, do you think the countries who are least responsible for climate change, the ones suffering with some of the worst impact in 21st century, how can these countries show the developed countries who are funding the climate finance that we can actually channel these funds into addressing the climate crisis?
This is a great question. You know, some time ago, I recently read this book. It's called The Nutmeg Curse, and the book was written by one of my favorite author, Amitav Ghosh, and it talks so poignantly about the fact that this is going to be really uncomfortable for some people. The fact that colonialism and the way we address climate crisis bear similarities, bear the fact that when we think about the impact of climate crisis and how it would severely impacted a lot more negatively the least developed countries that have a lot less responsibility over carbon emissions, tend to be at the receiving end of the disasters. And this is where conversation that is not happening fast enough around loss and damage compensation for countries that is currently feeling the impact. This is also what I think is the role of civil society and someone like Aisha that is currently right there in Sharm el-Sheikh trying to be involved in this conversation. But what I know for sure is there's not enough of us people who are impacted that sits in the decision-making table. There's not enough of us that have that doesn't quite have the same level of power in negotiation. There's currently sitting at the table and siding with people that are most impacted by the climate crisis. I think we need to unite in our demand to the government and therefore to the global government, to the wider public as well, to make sure that we still have a future in this planet.
Yeah, certainly. And I echo that statement very much, that there's not enough representation of the countries who are actually feeling the impact of climate change at the negotiation table. We just heard yesterday, there's a news story saying that 25% of delegates who are coming to COP27 are coming from fossil fuels industry. This is even higher than the number of delegates coming from countries like Antigua and Barbuda, Pakistan, who are already facing the climate crisis challenge. So I'd love to bring in Aisha's back in this conversation. You can just turn off your camera so your internet is better. Aisha, can you update us about your observation on the loss and damage conversation at COP27 and whether or not you see that there's any significant progress coming out of the COP27 on reaching the 100 billion climate finance and how that plays out with the whole climate justice conversation globally?
Sure. And just again, my apologies. The internet in the country is really bad because there's so many people in one area due to COP. But on the topic of climate finance, and I think you just said that there are 25% lobbyists and fossil fuel industry executives. Actually, there are 25% more than last year. So at the moment, I think the current statistics are there are 600 lobbyists from corporations and fossil fuel industry at the conference. And I am both Pakistani and American, and I think in order to talk about climate finance, that nuance needs to be established. So loss and damage finance has been being asked for by the global South nations, by indigenous communities, by vulnerable communities for 30 years. This is the first time in the COP process that it is officially on the agenda. And even then, loss and damage finance is not in the framework of justice in totality. Loss and damage finance at the moment, the current liability parts of it and the requirements for governments in the global north to have transparent commitment are not established. And a good analogy I've kind of developed for all those who are listening to understand really what is happening around climate finance is the following. If the climate crisis is a plane crashing, loss and damage finance operates as a life jacket and a mask to escape the plane and survive. So you can jump out. But that life jacket and mask are absolutely worthless if you don't know how to use them. And this is where a technical facility called the Santiago Network comes into play. Santiago Network are the instructions for implementing loss and damage finance. Guys, Santiago Network is still not been established, and it has been years. And that is really unfortunate because nations can say $100 billion, $200 billion, $300 billion. That money, it means nothing if it isn't being distributed to the communities. On top of that, the climate finance goal for $100 billion is already old. The data that was used to create this goal is as old as 2009. And that money still has not come to the communities. What the General Secretary and those of us who are in the climate justice space are demanding is that 100 billion be distributed equally between mitigation and adaptation. But the statistics are even more scary. This year alone, corporations, high net worth individuals, and fossil fuel industry has had $600 billion in bailouts, in tax bailouts. Civil society, vulnerable countries like mine, are demanding only 1/6 of that among all of us. We're demanding 1/6 of that $600 billion in tax havens. And that still has not been committed. And I think it would be really unfortunate and remiss of me if I did not share the role of the United States in this. The United States is introducing carbon credits and mechanisms for it to offset its emissions. and through carbon coins. I see on the chat that somebody said that they can't hear me. Is that the case?
We can hear you well.
Okay, cool. The United States is introducing carbon tax and mechanisms to offset its emissions, and it's calling it climate finance. The way that these offsetting and carbon markets will operate is the US will work to reduce emissions domestically to a certain extent, and then it will buy land or buy areas to reduce emissions in the global south. And global south nations will not be able to use that area to reduce their total and their goals of emission reductions. This will not only put those nations on another backtrack and not be able to meet their emission goals effectively, it will also mean that indigenous communities, areas that have already, the speaker before me mentioned, already been protecting havens of biodiversity, they will be sold off to the highest bidder. And they will, and the protection of those environments will go into their portfolios as emission reductions. And so it is putting indigenous territories and indigenous people's roles also at risk. And that is what we're seeing happening at this conference. And it is really, really unfortunate.
Mm. Aisha, thanks for sharing that with us. I want to ask your perspective about the climate bill that the US Congress recently passed. This has been called the landmark climate bill, of course, because it puts the US back on its climate leadership role globally, and is focusing on clean energy incentives with a spending about $300 to $370 billion. Now, you are leading the Fossil Free University, and you're also you're a co-founder of the Polluters Out, which aims to end the fossil fuel use. Can you share with us what this bill mean for the overall climate target and ambition of the United States?
I think it is a wonderful step forward, especially with IRA and also the bill ensuring that vulnerable communities, indigenous communities, and communities domestically get the resources that they need for climate justice. At the same time, one can both applaud the US for putting forward the most progressive bill in climate that it ever has, but this still is not nearly enough in relative comparison to the amount of emissions that the United States produces, the United States' role in the climate crisis. Because if the climate crisis has taught us anything, it's that it doesn't matter if the US emits emissions in New York. Eventually, they will affect people in Pakistan. The globe, the atmosphere, it is circular, and it will affect communities eventually. So I think it is both a wonderful step forward, but also this is the United States' responsibility. This is the debt that the United States owes both to its citizens and citizens abroad. And also at the same time, the US is exploiting our own domestic areas for new fossil fuel infrastructure. We cannot have any more drilling. We cannot keep investing in fossil fuel. And you mentioned Polluters Out, and this is a campaign I started, but I think it is also really important for those who are listening to know that the conference I'm at the moment and conferences in the past, they have had not just fossil fuel lobbyists, they've had fossil fuel funding sponsoring them. And this puts us back in policy. We cannot have a world that is safe and secure if we don't transition into green energy quickly enough. And if we keep giving breaks, tax havens, and financial opportunities to the corporations that are destroying our environment, we will not be able to save it. And if my words are not enough, the General Secretary's words should be a warning. It should send shivers down everybody's spine, because he is not coming from a place of emotion. He is coming from empirical data. The science is saying this. I mean, we are on a highway to destruction.
Thanks, Aisha. And I see that there are many people commenting on the chat box, but I'd like to bring in one very good question here. And this comes from someone in Afghanistan. This is from Atufa Subla, University of Kashmir. How can we think or calculate climate change and climate justice at a local community level, where even the majority of people are not educated and the youth is not active in the context of SDGs? And I find this very important because what Aisha is doing, what Fariza is doing, is because you know about the problem. There's a biodiversity crisis, there's a climate crisis, then we are pulled into action. But what happens if there's not enough education about it and people don't know what kind of future they're heading towards, right? So perhaps I'll give it to Fariza first and then back to Aisha.
It's knowing is one thing, experiencing is another. A lot of us come from a place of Western education, and this entire climate conversation tend to happen in that context. And for us, here's the thing: when we engage our communities, we don't necessarily talk the language of climate change, but people on the ground understand the implications of this forest destruction. They understand the changes in the environment. They take notice of what's going on because their relationship with the land. And each and every one of us might not necessarily, on the personal level, play such a huge roles in emitting carbons. But those knowledge that we have on what we could do to protect our environment is knowledge that tend to be inherent, at least in the community that I'm engaged with. Interestingly, as Aisha mentioned earlier, politics and policy are not something that is separate. As long as our political agenda are still funded and set by those that benefit from continue to emit emissions into the atmosphere, we can't move forward into a climate that is more livable. And this become a personal invitation to folks out there that is currently not an activist to find themselves in places where they could influence policy making better. Although I'm quite big on taking on personal responsibility to reduce our own personal emissions, at the same time, we come to realize that policy and regulations need to happen at the national and at global level. It doesn't matter, to an extent, this sounds terrible, but it doesn't matter how much you and I turning off the lights or unplugging our phones from charger on the wall, when the country still choose to provide us energy powered by coal power. And the fact that our politics are very expensive and our politicians are so closely entangled with these highly emitting industries, we can't imagine that they would be practically biting the hands that feed them. So a whole lot of us need to be more active and engaged in these issues. I wish our education include environmental ecological processes as part of the curriculum in the same way that we learn about math. You can't fight the law of nature. You can't adjust the law of nature. Nature would take its course. Now it's up to us to understand it, and it's up to us to respond to it.
Thank you, Fariza. And Aisha, before I let you answer, I'd like to add another layer to the question, right? So Bawiza said that politics and policy is interconnected, and as long as our political agenda still benefits those corporations, we will never move on and we'll never make progress. Now, can you share with us what are the lessons learned from the Congress being bipartisan and then passing the climate bill, and how was that achieved? Was it through the people, the young people demanding to the government? How did it go, and what can we learn from it?
So I'll answer that first, and then I'd love to answer the question that Fariza answered. I believe that the push, the the push from civil society really did allow the election of a federal government that signed off on this bill, that allowed for the election of congressional candidates that continued to push this bill. And I think the role of young people, especially organizations like Sunrise Movement, organizations like Fridays for Future, youth in their college campuses that are demanding divestment, the push of indigenous communities in the United States have made this bill possible. The reason why they have made this bill possible is because this bill intends on helping them solve the issue of climate change. They will be the people bringing the solutions. On the issue of how can we get young people who don't know about climate change more involved, the case of Afghanistan and even Pakistan, I mean, it's very similar. When flooding happened in Pakistan, it also happened in Afghanistan. And I echo Fariza in saying that our communities might not have the word climate change in their repertoire, might not understand carbon emissions, but when your home is flooded, you know that's not natural. And when your soil is not producing food anymore, you know that's not natural. My grandparents did not have a science background. I mean, I come from a tribal indigenous community, but they understood that the climate was changing at such a rapid speed. And the part that it is innate. Those of us who are connected to the land, whether you are an agriculture or a farmer or somebody who uses the land to survive, you can watch it changing, and it is affecting communities internally, but also our livelihoods. So it's really obvious. It's more about getting the language to them because the concept is there. And on that point, I think we also need to understand that the reason why climate education is not as widely available is because the language it is being communicated in. It is being communicated in the language of the global north. It is being communicated in the language of prophets, and it is being communicated in English. So of course, it is harder for people to catch up. And but at the same time, climate education, again, I'm going to echo Fariza, should be taught like math is, because this is survival education. If you don't know what to do to prevent your home from drowning, if you don't, when you enter a new building, you do a fire drill. We need climate education because it is our educational fire drill. It will teach us how to escape, prevent, and stop. And yeah, those are just my thoughts.
Thanks, Aisha, and thanks, Fariza, for that very inspiring messages. As we near the end of this conversation, I'd like to ask one final question. So we are nearing the end of 2022, and this year we have seen no shortage of crisis at the global scale. We have Russia's invasion of Ukraine that triggered a food crisis and then an energy crisis, especially for our friends in Africa. I know that there's also tons of audience tuning in from Africa, from Nigeria, Ghana right now in this Zoom room. But the climate crisis is one that we have been grappling with for the past decades and is our future unless we take action, right? So how do we still maintain our focus, our attention, our ambition, and our action towards the climate crisis and putting this front and center despite whatever's going on in the world? I just give this to whoever would like to comment first.
I'm gonna let Aisha.
You actually cut out for me, so I didn't hear all of the question.
So I was saying, Aisha, this year we have seen no shortage of crisis, from Russia's invasion of Ukraine that led to a food crisis and then an energy crisis, and many others, right? So despite everything that's going on, how do we keep our focus and attention still on the climate crisis? And how do we make sure that we're not backtracking on our progress here?
I think it's unfortunate that we're competing for attention for crises. The thing about the climate crisis is whether you want to give it attention or not, it will dominate the conversation eventually. We are experiencing war. We are experiencing so many different issues all over the world. But the climate crisis, the way that it is accelerating, and the kind of global warming we will be in by the year 2030, 2040, 2050, it will lead to more destruction than any war that has come to pass. And also about the climate crisis will create all other crises because it uses the already pre-existing structures of hierarchy and destruction to cause more destruction. It will cause more refugees. It will cause more inflation. It will cause more hunger. It will cause more disease. Every issue that we can imagine, from mass hunger to mass health crisis to displacement, it will cause that. And the sooner we see this intersectionality, the more that we can realize that it is not competing for attention. We can give attention to both, multiple crises with due respect, but eventually this will dominate. And we have to give more energy and more resources to prevent this.
Thank you, Aisha. Mawiza, over to you.
Yeah, and to add to that, Aisha put it on a very fine point, the fact that climate crisis would exacerbate every other crisis. It would raise inequality. Every progress that we have put in towards the equality between gender equality, to eliminate food insecurity, to greatly reduce poverty, we would step many steps backward when the climate crisis unfold. One suggestion from me would be simply to come to understand that each of us have a role to advance towards the solution of the crisis that we are facing today. When we reach the understanding of our planetary boundary, as Aisha mentioned, climate crisis would happen regardless we understand it or not, regardless we agree to it or not, regardless of our opinion of it. Climate crisis would continue unfolding, and the biological processes would continue unfolding unless we take major significant action to reduce our own emission and head towards a more habitable future. But yeah, each of us have a role to play, and it's up to us to play that role, be it as forest conservation, climate activists, business, student, youth, and politicians too.
Well said. And as we say it in FPCI, climate change is the mother of all problems. Aisha said that point too. We already see climate change happening. The climate crisis is already here. It's not going to happen in the next decade or in the next 100 years. It's already here. Even in Indonesia, we see floodings every year in Jakarta, right? And who are most impacted by that? It's usually the most vulnerable. So there's a lot of intersectionality that's happening here, which is why it's very important for the civil societies like us here gathering the Zoom room, whether you're in Indonesia, Australia, from United States or Africa, to strengthen our voice and call for climate action. In FPCI, we call for net zero Indonesia by 2050, as agreed upon by the Paris Agreement. That's why I'm wearing this t-shirt, right? So, just to wrap up this Climate Heroes dialogue, over the past year, FPCI has been bringing along various stakeholders and actors from the political sector, from the government, from the business leaders, from the activists, from students, and everybody realized that no matter where you are, whether you're a student or whatever it is that your title has, that you have the moral obligation and moral duty to call for a net zero world, for solving the climate challenge. And with that, let me thank Aisha, who for spending her time here with us for the past 1 hour, updating us on what's going on at COP27, and of course, representing the young people of the Global South as well. There, I know that Aisha just hosted a youth pavilion at COP27. Thank you also to Mawiza, for all that you do in protecting our trees in Indonesia, and we hope that you continue your great work and you will always find a friend in FPCI. I would also now would like to give the floor and the mic to Ambassador Dino Jalal, the chairman of FPCI, to give last closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Esther. And first, I want to apologize for, actually, I'm not in Indonesia now. I'm in Paris, not the worst place on earth to be. And I'm somewhere on a cafe sipping my cafe latte. But I've been following this discussion, and I want to say thank you to Esther, the climate director of FPCI, who's been leading this program, and she's done a wonderful job at it. And for FPCI, climate agenda is our priority for last year and this year. And I remember last year when we began this campaign, we felt alone because the government had not adopted any significant climate policy as yet. They had not announced a net zero commitment and so forth. And they remain stuck on the 29-41% formula of emission reduction. But I'm glad through very concerted action campaign with other climate and environmental organizations, we have been able to push the government to advance and reform their position. And now their positions have moved. Although at FPCI, we're still not satisfied. I think net zero by 2060 is still it's still not sufficient. And we hope that one day they will move it up to net zero 2045, or at least net zero 2050. I'm feeling a bit bummed or down because on the plane here, I read The Economist, where they had the front cover that said goodbye 1.5 degree world, right? I think some of you probably read it. And basically, The Economist argued that at this point in time, we don't have enough carbon budget to achieve the 1.5 degree world. And the best thing we can hope for is not to overshoot too much beyond 1.5 degree world, right? So this is the context by which the COP27 meeting is taking place in Egypt. And to be honest, I have always been a bit worried about this. Yeah? I've always felt, hey, are we doing enough to achieve the 1 degree world? Are we being honest about the prospect of this? Because first, there's just too many distractions, the COVID pandemic, the Ukraine war, and all the other issues that are just taking resources and attention away from climate action. And secondly, there's just a lack of political will in many places, including in countries that have submitted bolder and bolder NDCs. But if you look at it closely, a lot of these NDCs do not come up with a real plan, a real strategy on how resources are going to be allocated to achieve those NDCs. So the political will has been very uneven to achieve that net zero targets. And thirdly, I feel that the politics in the diplomacy, in the climate diplomacy, is just too much. There's just too much inconsistency, too much bickerings, and too much division, right? And, when I was in government, I was involved in many of these climate diplomacies. And as I look at it now, it's just pretty much mostly the same things, right? You have thousands of diplomats just arguing endlessly. And what it amounts to, I've said this over and over again, what it amounts to is that in the last few years, we're stuck with too much incremental steps and not enough transformational change, right? Meaning, yes, more business joining net zero pledge. We got more EVs, more electric cars, more green buildings. I checked into my hotel room. I got this nice wooden, a carbon-free card and all that. A lot of these nice small things, but they don't add up. all these incremental small things don't add up, right? Don't add up to deliver the 1.5 degree world. Don't add up to make us use that 400 billion carbon tons effectively to achieve climate security. And unfortunately, that's the truth that we have to face now. The politics, the diplomacy, the finance are just not going to bring us to 1.5 degree unless something really drastic happens, right? So I think we are in a place where we need to start thinking about plan B. You know, what is plan B? Does that mean that we will have to accept a 2 degree world, right? And if it's a 2 degree world, do we have enough resources and political will to bring us there, right? On the diplomatic front, on the political front, and on the economic front, right? I don't have the answer to that, but I tell you, this is the hardest fight of the next 5 years, the next 10 years is really the most consequential, in my view, of human history. Because as Esther said, climate change is the mother of all problems. And if you don't get it right, our industries, our infrastructure, our agriculture, our urban planning, even conflicts and so on, are going to be severely affected by it. You know, they said that climate refugees now, for the first time, is more than the refugees coming from war and conflicts for the first time, right? So really, it's a new world, and we got only 5 years or 10 years the most to make things right, and we really got to think hard about this. But like I said, unfortunately, incremental, small steps rule the world now, and we're not seeing the kind of transformational, revolutionary change that we need to bring the world to net zero world by 2050. So again, thank you all for joining the Climate Heroes program. We have been able to attract 10,000 people in our programs to listen to many aspects of climate change. I want to thank Rachel Cook from the U.S. Embassy for their support for this program. And again, I want to thank Esther, our climate director, and everybody who has been part of this program. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I'm a bit emotional about this because, you know, it's just, yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Dino. And you touch on a very sentimental note about the problem of the climate crisis. But again, while we are losing time, there's still time for action. So which is why at the chat room, our team has shared, if you're an Indonesian, please sign our petition to call for climate action for the government of Indonesia, declare net zero emissions by 2050. Again, I'd love to thank our phenomenal speakers today, Aisha and Farwiza, for joining us. Hopefully we can meet again in the future, and we will always support your work. You will always have a friend in FPCI. Thank you, everybody, and I'll pass it back over to the MC.
Thank you very much, Esther, and thank you, Ambassador Dino, for your remarks. And thank you once again, of course, to our distinguished speakers. It is amazing always hearing you speak on this very important issue that concerns us all. And ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up the finale dialogue of the Climate Heroes series. Thank you very much for everyone for your participation, for attending the dialogue today. And for your information, you can rewatch our past Climate Heroes dialogue on our website, www.fpciclimate.org, or through our YouTube channel, Secretariat FPCI. We have in total 8 dialogues for you that can be accessed anywhere and anytime through our channels with excellent climate heroes from the US and Indonesia. And everyone, before you leave tonight, we encourage you to take climate action by signing a petition at change.org/darurat iklim, as written in the chat box, to collectively ask for a net zero world by 2050 and a 50% emissions reduction by 2030. And don't forget to also fill in the Google form to confirm your attendance tonight and retrieve your e-certificate. And once again, thank you very much for everyone for tuning in to the Climate Heroes Finale Dialogue. Stay tuned to our social media at FPC Indo on Instagram and Twitter for the latest updates on our programs. And see you in the future FPCI climate events.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.